So we'll start to stay very much on time. Now Charles has already been introduced, so I only introduce Chiara, who holds an LLM from Harvard Law School and a PhD from the European University Institute. And she is a real European creature. So Chiara started working at the legal service of the Council of Ministers, and from there moved on in the European hierarchy, and has, since its establishment, worked at the European Central Bank, and of course since 2013 she was General Counsel. Since then she has been General Counsel at the ECB. And represents, of course, the institution in front of the ECJ. And she's also, we are lucky to have her professor at Goethe University in Frankfurt. And Rupert Schaefer, I'm also honored to present to you. He studied both, again, also like a predecessor in Germany and in France, in this case in Saarland at the University of Nancy. And also, in addition, sort of like Chiara, obtained a Master of European Law. And before joining BaFin, where Rupert Schaefer is right now, he spent over a decade, just like BaFin's president, at FINMA in Switzerland, where he served on the executive board, leading different decisions, strategic services, and recovery and resolution. And since November 22, he's been Chief Executive Director of Strategy, Policy, and Control at BaFin. And brings to us, which I'm looking forward to actually experience in both Swiss and German regulatory systems. And, although the Swiss would say don't even speak the same language, but they sort of speak the same language. They're relatively different in many important ways. So we had said beforehand that each one of you was going to kind of give a couple of remarks to start us off, and then we might see whether we discuss among ourselves and open it up to the audience. So do we also want to do ladies first and have Chiara start?
Do you hear me? Yes. Thank you. Differences. Yes, there are some differences in the independence to be applied in monetary policy and in supervision. First of all, I would say you need to look at why is independence there. And without repeating what has been said, it's clear that in central banking, the independence reason is the objective that has been given to the central bank. And so price stability is the reason to separate the bank from the political pressure, which is short-term, while the objective monetary policy is, or the price stability is medium to long-term. This is a reason for derogating to democratic principle. We spoke about it before. This is an exception to the democracy principle. You, Katja, addressed it at the beginning, through which in our society it is the citizens who need to elect those who then decide. But this exception has been even recognized by the German Constitutional Court as being a valid one for this reason. Now, this is not the same for financial stability and supervision, in fact, because the objective there is not price stability, it is the safety and stability of the institution, of banking institution, and the financial stability in general. These are objectives that are extremely important, of course, but they do require more assessment, more evaluation. There are several elements that come into the consideration. So they also require more accountability. Now, accountability does not mean that you cannot have independence, but it means that independence has a certain different feature and different nuances. Linked to this, you could see that the people who from which the relationship for which this independence is given is different. So if you read the text, and we don't have time now to go through the exact articles, but of the Article 130, so the independence for the ECB and which was considered and thought for monetary policy, at least initially. The focus is independence from political bodies, and that includes also the legislator. It's not only the government, yeah? So it's also the parliament. And then comes the last sentence that said, and any other body. This is really a suffix, sort of. When you go to Article 19 of the SSM regulation, it talks explicitly of any other public or private body. Private is an addition. And when you go now to the changes that have intervened in Europe very recently, so the CRD 6 that entered into force the 10th of January, there you really see that the list of those from which you need to be independent is reverted. So first of all, independent from the people you supervise, then from the public, and then from all the other public and private. So it seems that the concern of independence for the supervision is complemented not only the public but also the private. So the concern of equal treatment, the concerns of impartiality. It's a little bit different. That is one thing I will say. I will make two more points, basically on the personal independence and on the organizational independence. There as well, there are differences in both. So if you look at organizational independence, while the article of the treaty talks about the independence of the institutions, so the ECB and the NCBs and their board members, the Article 19 does not talk about the independence of, or the acting independently of the entity, of the institution, but only of the board members. So there is this differentiation, which comes from the fact that, as you, Katja, correctly mentioned already, in Germany, for example, the institution itself is not independent. It is linked to the ministry. So you could not put that in. Yeah? And that is also now redressed, however, by the CRD 6 that now requires to be independent in a broad way. The personal independence is also different. So the protection that is in the statute for the government in particular, so the protection from dismissal, the locus standing in the court, did not exist in the Article 19 comes and goes, I'm sorry, of the SSM regulation. Now the CRD 6 has added a number of protection, but still there is no locus standing at the Court of Justice. So there is still a nuance, a differentiation, but a lot of protection has been added there. A very last point, this difference that you see in Europe, however, does not apply to the ECB as an institution. Because I've argued, and I continue to argue, that Article 130 applies to the institution as such. And even though there have been discussion whether the sentence for the task conferred by this treaty, whether the supervision which comes from Article 127, which was the enabling provision that already transferred the competence subject to a condition, whether this is treaty. In any event, the doubts are solved by looking at another article, 282 of the treaty, where it is said that the ECB is independent in the exercise of its powers. And that includes also the supervisory one. So in Europe, at the ECB, we are in a situation where to protect the institution properly, the independence covers all its, the scope of its actions. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you already. Yeah, whoever would want to...
Why don't you go first?
Yeah, okay, so you can...
Yeah, sure. So this question of independence, I think it's really fascinating from a conceptual, academic point of view, but it's also highly important from a practical view. And for me, it's an honor to contribute as a practitioner here. And I'll offer my personal views, I would say, from my experience in supervision. So let's start with similarities when we compare supervision to monetary policy. And I think there are some very important similarities on the fundamental issue of why is independence necessary and important. And it goes back to this question of we are serving within our mandate, which is given to us by Parliament, really for long-term public good. And we have heard before there is this time inconsistency problem potentially conflicting short-term interests. And I think in particular when you think about banking supervision, this is a real issue. It's a real temptation to say, for example, well, let's incentivize our banks to invest in sovereign debt from my country. Let's invest, or let's make sure that banks are investing in infrastructure, in greening the real economy, providing affordable housing. So you will find many examples or potential cases where we'd say, let's maybe just try to shift the way banks are providing credit. And that's why I think this independence is important, and it's not an end in itself. And there I would probably disagree, or I couldn't disagree more. Actually, what you said, I think we are able to take decisions, and supervisors will take decisions whenever it's necessary. And this independence is a critical precondition to be doing that. So on the fundamentals, I think it's very similar. The risks and the temptations coming with independence are also very similar. So there is the question of mission creep, that you are maybe with good intentions trying to deliver by extending your mandate beyond what's given to you, creating also trade-offs. There's also the real issue, I think, of managing expectations, that maybe the public or the political side is overloading your mandate. So independence has also some downside risks. So then maybe still on the similarities, I think the way independence is organized is very similar. Of course, accountability is very important as a flip side of independence. And maybe some differences now. Because supervisory authorities, they have different roles in the end. We have a role also in the rule setting, and there I would say independence cannot work, because this is a delegated task we receive from Parliament or the legislative branch of government. So whenever we are or we are participating in international standard setting, in implementing EU law, then of course we are not totally free, but we have to follow the directions of the Parliament and executive branch. Where to the other side, where we are purely involved in supervising a bank, an insurance company, and we are dealing with individual firms, there we are free and we are independent, and that's also recognized. You mentioned that before. In the principles of good cooperation between the Ministry of Finance and BaFin, where this respect is expressly reflected. Whenever we take supervisory decisions in our core mandate, then we are independent. Interesting space, I would say, is crisis management. So when we think about too big to fail banks, in particular the banking and sovereign nexus, there I would say, well, independence is maybe not what you would expect in practice, because as an authority you are not able to manage such a crisis. You will always need the lender of last resort, which is the central bank, and it's highly probable that you will also need some, I would say, facilitation at least from government, or some sort of fiscal backstop in the end. Hopefully you are not obliged to bail out a bank, but I think that's not a way where a purely technocratic authority could decide on a case which such a potential impact on the fiscal side. So I would say that there are some nuances when it comes to independence, and maybe we'll discuss later on what independence means in practice and how it can work.
Thank you very much. That was very helpful for me.
Well, I guess it's good to have some disagreement, and the disagreement's pretty extreme. So I would say, in my experience, when I served on the European Systemic Risk Board's committee, was that banks were basically insolvent, large banks, French banks in particular, and it was being ignored. And when I went to the Bank of France to give a seminar and talk about implementing different regulations, and spoke to senior people about, you recognize that currently some of these French banks can't even borrow any money in the markets. They said, we don't believe in markets. It's very convenient. So the point is, you've been tested, unfortunately, and you failed. And that's not just you. And I don't want to just say that this is a political influence problem, but it is partly a political influence problem. I would also say it's not homogeneous. I've experienced very different kinds of communications from different regulatory authorities within Europe. Some are worse than others. So let's be honest. And by the way, I live in a glass house called the United States. It's just as bad. So I don't think it's just because bankers are politically influential. That's part of it. But the reason that independence is not going to solve this problem, since it hasn't already, is because there's another problem. It is simply too much to expect of a civil servant to cause chaos. A civil servant isn't going to wake up someday and say, the largest bank in France or the largest bank in the US has just suffered a major problem and needs to raise a huge amount of capital. That isn't going to happen. But you need it to happen. You need someone to actually recognize reality that changes quickly and to actually stand up and say, this is the reality. The current apparatus is incapable of that. Show me the example of when it ever did it, and you won't be able to. So, what can cause a change? If you create credible, visible, transparent measures that have regulatory power connected to them, banks will then know that they can't let this get out of hand, and they will act proactively to prevent themselves from getting into these circumstances. And then the supervisory and regulatory apparatus simply becomes the way of enforcing a pre-written, transparent, and visible rule. That works, and we have lots of examples of that working. So let's stop fooling ourselves. Now, I also want to point out that people who talk the way I talk very rarely end up in regulatory organizations. I'll tell you something funny. So I was chief economist of the OCC. After I left the OCC, everyone was very relieved. Furthermore, they abolished the position of chief economist at the OCC. I'm not joking. They abolished it. But why? Because I was constantly pointing out in meetings what measures people were using that were nonsense. No one I worked with at the OCC, the most senior people, knew what a standard deviation was, knew what a distance to default was. No one knew what a standard deviation, a distance to default. Forget S-risk, forget COVAR, forget, it was remarkable. Remarkable. And certainly no one wanted any information about it. Now, the one thing that worked in our favor was that we wanted to compete to charter new banks. And all the new banks we wanted to charter were going to be fintech banks. So they didn't have balance sheets. So the whole Basel nonsense couldn't even be applied to these institutions. And so people started saying, well, how do we set up prudential capital requirements and supervision? I said, well, what if we used financial economics? That's a bold idea, completely outside their experience, but they had no alternative. So I got 30 PhD economists together. We created different approaches for doing this. We presented them to the board. I have some slides. I'll show you some of the slides I presented to the OCC. I'm just going to skip ahead to them. The point of it, of course, I presented all these slides to tell them, hey, if you used economic value, you would have predicted all the problems that were coming instead of just trying to clean up the mess. But here are some of the slides I used, okay? So basically, the hardest thing was to say, you know, when you think about risk, you should think about, and valuation, you should think about cash flows. Now, notice that financial accounting doesn't measure line of business cash flows. That's how banks manage themselves and their own risks. And so I said to them, we need to change, when we examine, we actually examine by lines of business and then we throw all the data away. Why don't we keep those data? and actually start tracking the cash flows for lines of business and start thinking about measuring the value of the organization based on its lines of business and then measuring its risk that way. It was like, you mean create new accounting information? I said, yeah. By the way, the reason the Fed has so much regulatory and supervisory power is because they create the Y12s, the Y9s, and all these data. What if the OCC created its own new data source on line of business managerial accounting of banks and then used it to actually implement regulation and supervision to measure value and to measure risk? And people just thought, this man is crazy. What he's telling us is he wants the regulator to think about risk the way the banks themselves think about it. How crazy is that? Completely crazy. Okay, so we have different ways of doing this, 3 different methodological approaches, one based on cash flow simulations, one based on multiples regression approaches that try to use characteristics of banks to measure their characteristics, and third, implied value changes using Black-Scholes models, distance to default. So all of this is like, old standard stuff. All the empirical work shows that these are the things that measure risk. They show that these are the things that reliably measure the risk of banks so that you can stop them before they die. Those are all things that are completely ignored. Now, when we used them, we showed the people not only that they were effective, but we also showed them how you could do it. And we applied them. I can't show you these slides because they're confidential. They're part of the regulatory record, and I'm not allowed to share them with you. But we took particular institutions and showed you how you could set a standard. When I said to people, what do you want the default risk to be of your banks? Well, we don't want any banks to default. I said, you don't understand. Do you want there to be a 1% chance over 3 years that the bank fails? Or do you want it to be 0.5% or 0.2%? Like, they said, what? We're not a bond rating agency. I said, well, you have to act like a bond rating agency if you want to have a coherent idea of what you're doing. Okay, so we did this for some fintech startups because they needed to have an answer and they couldn't get the answer with the nonsense Basel stuff. But then we had all this work, 30 PhD economists working to figure out how to do this to apply to all the banks. We could have done it immediately and then established this accounting system for managerial accounting that would have made it so much more accurate and better over time. But instead, they abolished the position of the chief economist. I just want to make one final comment. If you go back 130 years, the brilliance of the supervisory and regulatory system of banks in the US was that it intentionally integrated market discipline with regulatory power. It was done through supervision and regulation. When an examiner came to a bank, the examiner's assessment of the bank's loss risks turned out to be brilliant. Why? Because the examiners all were former bankers. Very interesting. They knew how to measure risk. They measured the risk incredibly accurately, including using soft information, which my own study with Mark Carlson at the Federal Reserve Board has shown. Secondly, the accounting that resulted from their forcing banks to write down their assets based on those assessments had to be published by the bank in the newspaper. And then the bank had to clip it from the newspaper and send it to the examiner to show that they had revealed it to the market and revealed themselves, since there was no deposit insurance, to the market reacting to this news. That's called credibility. That's called competency. It worked great. We no longer have that politics. We have the politics of bank protection by the taxpayer, enforced by the government, and then bank examiner pretending that banks are all fine. That's why they abolished the position of chief economist.
So I think we'll do a first round among ourselves.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm very emotional about these topics.
I definitely have Rupert Schaefer react. I also have a question in reaction to John's.
Well, of course, I'm tempted to react there because I really don't agree, and I'm very sorry that you had such a bad experience in the supervisory work.
In Europe.
Well, I'm not sure whether the ESRB.
That's the one that was the worst.
Not sure whether the ESRB is really a supervisor, at least the scientific committee. But I mean, I think you hinted to a very interesting point, how to measure the success and the performance of a supervisor. That's very difficult. And I think it's even more difficult than measuring the performance of monetary policy, because there, however you would interpret the low inflation target, at least you have a measurable quantitative target. And supervisory work is mostly, I would say, it's not visible, because you are not allowed to communicate on the cases, you are not allowed to communicate on the measures you are taking, but you can be assured that of course we are taking measures. In particular when a bank is going into a crisis, and you have a variety of measures. Of course you have book values, that's the way the whole accounting framework is working, and there can be a discussion, of course, can we trust accounting rules, but still that's the way largely the financial world operates. And then you have also fair value, and we all know that fair value is also a difficult concept, because what's fair, which value is fair, that's volatile, that's sometimes a bit subjective, but that's also a measure we look at, and that's part of the whole framework. When you look at the trading book, that's not book value, that's really market value. So I would say the world is, at least what you described, is not the world we see today in supervision here in Europe. And still there remains this challenge, how to measure the success of a supervisory authority and how to build the trust you need also from the larger public. Because in the end, the legal foundation for independence is important, but in the end, you need the trust that you are delivering on your mandate, and that's a challenge for us because we cannot really measure. We always see that the bank is failing, and then there's the question: why did not react earlier? But we cannot make the case whenever we are taking measures that are not public.
Yeah. And I mean, I also have a question for you, Charles, because if I'm following correctly, your example with the French banks, so your argument goes as follows. You're like, okay, the French banks were in really bad shape. Nothing happened. So the first question is, why would non-independence have been better? Because that would have been the alternative,
I didn't say,
right?
No, I didn't say that. I said independence is beside the point largely.
Because
it's not entirely beside the point, because I agree with you that political influence of the banks is a big deal.
Right.
And it currently happens in Europe a lot, right? So let's not pretend it doesn't. But I'm saying that isn't the only thing. And the problem is that you just can't, it's not reasonable to expect civil servants on their own discretion to make very big announcements voluntarily. If you make it transparent based on observable information, and you create a default requirement that they must act based on that information, you protect them and they will enforce the rules. But if you try to depend on them on their own voluntary action to reveal facts and enforce things, that's just nonsense. That's not the way the world works.
I mean, I'm not as sure about that kind of social psychology point, but I have a different question, just from the outsider, not understanding it. So one question about is, aren't there a lot of internal rating-based assessments that do precisely that look to what the bank measures, sort of inside the bank, uses the bank risk management for supervisory purposes? At least that's what, as again,
So what the head of Deutsche Bank said to me was that he keeps two different sets of accounts for risk management. One he shows the regulators, which is nonsense, and the other one which he actually uses to manage the bank.
And that leads me to my second question. Why do you think that would be different if you had the numbers publish you are looking for? Because I mean, as a corporate law person and corporate reporting person, I've seen a lot of fraudulent numbers. So why do you think that this, what you're advocating, which, you know, of course, in theory, it's always great to have visible, transparency, measurable numbers, but I guess I'm just a little more skeptical about the measurability and the transparency and how far this is going to take us.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I have a lot of slides about measurability, but of course I can't show you the details of them because they were part of the regulatory process. But let's just take a reality check for a minute. The concept of financial economics is designed to measure through attention to cash flows and market values. It's designed to measure valuation and risk, which is what our supervisory and regulatory system says it wants to do. So why would we ignore it all in favor of book values of assets? So let me ask a question of the panelists here. So suppose I have a bank that has a lot of fee-generated income that's delivering a sort of a very low-risk kinds of positive value to the bank, but it has no connection to any asset. So it doesn't affect the book value of your assets. It doesn't affect the book value of your capital. Shouldn't the existence of that lead you to have a more favorable impression of the bank? I know in the US we have the CAMEL system, so it would creep in through a little bit of that, but that's kind of not real. That's not the thing that, I'm not saying CAMEL's isn't real, I'm just saying it's very inaccurate, it's very rough. So the point is just, you want to actually measure what the bank is doing. When it's destroying value, you say it's destroying value. When it's creating value, you say it's creating value. When it's creating risk, destroying, you measure it. I mean, we teach our students, we teach the guys who are running the bank that this is how to run an enterprise, but then we don't regulate them or supervise them that way. This isn't a coincidence. The reason regulation and supervision is designed to be so dumb is because that is convenient. We shouldn't fool ourselves.
I will in a second open it up for discussion. I'm just a little more skeptical that, because also you were saying, well, but the Deutsche Bank is doing two things at the same time. So I would say Chiara gets to respond, and then I'm opening it up to discussion.
Just very briefly, I have the impression, because the system in the United States is different, that you are putting together very much regulation and supervision. So here we have a separation, so the regulation comes from Brussels. We have a space which is, however, limited for discretion. And my personal experience is that I know some colleagues who wake up in the morning and pester their superior. I don't know if then it goes up all the scale, but there are people, and I think this is admirable, who do that. The second point is we were talking about independence from states and from banks. And I have to say two things. First, as I'm a dinosaur at the bank, I've seen really a change since we took up supervision. There was a situation of too close relationship between the national supervisors and the big banks, which of course have a lot of also social impact in case you need to do something. I think it is better to have it at ECB. It's a little bit more detached. It's also not easy because the pressure comes here as well. It comes, and I have to say, from the states, from the national competent authority, and from the banks. They have a very powerful lobby. I have to say, as the head of legal, the highest number of cases that we have in court is from banks, particularly French, by the way, but okay. But I also have to say we won most of them. We have lost very few until now, so that is the other point.
Thank you. So before you answer, I think I would open it up for discussion. Yes, and yes, and yes. Please.
Charles, there are many issues I would agree with you on. I could take on, would take too long to what you said about ex-bankers serving in supervisory offices and all the like. Where I disagree, well, the head of a Deutsche Bank is not here today, so you will have to deal with an ex-CEO of a semi-large bank here in Germany that was that exploded in the aftermath of GFC, and I was called in to change it. The one thing where I completely disagree is, and certainly to pick up from Chiara, is the world has moved on since your experience at the OCC. If you speak to any banker, and I think there is a lot of truth in it, they are not concerned about supervisors who are not seeing the risks, who are too loose and too lax. On the contrary, if anything they are afraid of, and I've seen it from very close, is that they might be accused sometime later of having been too lax, that they overdo the details, and that they're too concerned with the details. And I could give you chapter and verse. I think the best example I can find, and I don't know whether Mr. Schaefer has something to add with his Swiss experience, is the discussion about the UBS. Certainly after having absorbed Credit Suisse, if there's anything that the Swiss are concerned about, is that a huge mammoth like UBS might at sometimes go under and take Switzerland with it. So they are, and this is the famous gold plating that takes place not only in Switzerland, but also to some degree here in Europe, certainly if you are some bankers. So the long and short of it is, I think times have changed. It could be improved. The expertise of some of the supervisors are perhaps not up to speed even now, but in terms of courage, in terms of, if anything, they perhaps need more courage, is not to be too afraid of taking some risk themselves.
So I think I'll collect, because I have the feeling they all want to react to you because all those hands were going up. Yes.
Yes, well, Charles, I loved your story. Of course, Gert Häusler is also right in the sense that the world moved on. And my own experience, I was in the Maas committee who designed the code banking in the Netherlands. There were 3 former vice chairmen, chief financial officers, and but former, and 1 professor. And what I was astonished about was the fact that the supervision was, ticking the boxes. Do you have a value of risk? Do you use it? Oh, yes. Oh, nice. And what do you do with it? Oh, you don't understand. So it was for me a kind of bizarre experience as a professor of financial economics to see that. And actually, it explains also the financial crisis. The financial crisis is a combination of bad risk management and poor governance. That's the combination which is killing. Arrogance and ignorance, I would say, to my students. But bad risk management has improved. Yes, it has improved. They use the models. There are more prudential supervisors who come from banks or from universities who use the models. That's true, but not enough in terms of transparency, I must say. And second, the governance, that's also a problem. If you look to the supervisory boards of banks, the internal supervision, and not only the external by the prudential supervisor. If you look to the experience, we speak about experts in central banking. Are there any experts in No. There was, there are diversity considerations, there are all kinds of considerations, but not the consideration that you need expertise as a banker or a financial economist, and importantly, both, that you combine all that expertise. It's sometimes the case, but it's not always the case. And I think the control mechanisms are first the internal supervision, so the supervisory board, if you have a 2-tier board, in the Netherlands it's a 2-tier board, that's not the Anglo-Saxon model, and then you don't want to arrive with the external supervisor. So my question to Charles is, has it improved? Yes. And how can we improve it further? How can we improve? So, bad risk management, less, better governance.
Say one sentence. So maybe it's improved in ways I haven't observed, and I'm open to that. So when I was working at the European Systemic Risk Board, the committee, we had a dickens of a time getting anyone to agree that sovereign debt should be risk-weighted. We had a very hard time with that. Okay, so I guess things have changed hugely, and now I guess if, let's say, the French government is no more than 5 years away from a debt crisis, right? Okay, So they're going to have a debt crisis. Yields on French bonds are going to go way up. French bond prices are going to go down. The French banks are going to be insolvent. And I'm sure the regulators are all going to decide to intervene, right? No.
We'll sample. Yes. Yeah, right.
Thank you. I have a short question, very brief. We have experienced the European Central Bank to become quite powerful, imposing guidelines, standards on a regular basis. And my question to Rupert and Chiara is basically, can we learn something out of the German practice that the Bundesbank and BaFin are working together? Maybe putting on referring on Andy, thinking about splitting the Fed. So the question is splitting the EZB into a monetary policy central bank, and on the other hand, splitting the banking supervision part.
I would like to collect the rest of questions, and then I would get each speaker. Yes. Yeah, the mic is coming.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the panel. So just a quick question, first of all, to Rupert and Chiara. So do we, in the European Union, do we lean too heavily on the time inconsistency idea to justify independence? So the time inconsistency idea that you were referring to, Rupert, before is based upon a single nation state where you have a single executive that can exercise significant power on the regulator. Whereas in the European Union, if you look at, say, the ECB, the idea that a single executive government could actually exercise influence when you have 21 different members voting and non-aligned interests, so non-aligned interests amongst the member states, it seems very unlikely that that pressure could actually be exercised. So I wonder whether we lean too heavily on that. And very, very quickly, just in relation to Charles, you're taking us back to a nostalgic time 130 years ago when you were talking about an approach to financial regulation that was superior. I don't know anything about that, but what I do know as a lawyer is that the law reports were littered with bank failures. So I'm not convinced that it was necessarily better than that.
Good. So no more questions. So everybody gets sort of the last round. Oh, there is one.
Hi. To Professor Charles, I think your intervention was very intellectually provoking, and I wanted to just react very quickly. I think you made 3 points to support why independence is not the best way to attain the goal, if I may, but I wanted to react on the 3. So the first one, the benchmark or the metrics that you apply. There may be merit in that. We may have a discussion on why we use the way we use, so risk-weighted assets, but maybe in the interest of time we skip. The other 2 are very interesting. The second one is epistemological, if you wish. So basically you're saying the market knows better than the supervisors, any supervisor would do. And you were mentioning the French. That's fascinating, again, intellectually. But a question that I have for you is, are we sure that it's always true? And I just raised one point, one question for you, and is it, are we sure that the market, with the information which is available, is able to understand internal models? The banks run better than supervisors do when they do on-site inspections and collect data and have specific expertise. So not saying that the supervisors really know as much as the bankers do, but there is at least a likelihood that they know better than the market. Third point, this is the most important one, I guess. Basically, you say independence doesn't work because there is an issue with allocation of incentives, and you may be. I mean, that can be summarized in the claim. Civil servants would never do what it takes to de-risk the system and so on, and that's interesting. I mean, this is the reason why I stood up to make this intervention, because probably the situation on the 2 sides of the oceans is quite far apart at the moment. I mean, because if you listen to the conversation in Europe, it's actually a different one. So you listen to banks saying that supervisors are too aggressive, and actually facts prove that things are a bit different than if I may, what you're claiming. I mean, if you look only at figures, you may see, I mean, if we believe in the market knowing best, it's true that market value of banks was below par until a few months ago, but now the performance on the markets of European banks has improved markedly. That means that something has changed. First point. Second point, I mean, about asking recapitalization. If you look at the capital value or capital requirements, sorry, of banks after the crisis, and you look at now, figures have changed massively. not only in absolute terms, but also in the quality of capital. Before we had all sorts of capital, now CET1 is the metrics that we look in Europe mainly. And if you look at the non-popular measures, you probably have followed the old discussion about non-performing loans and how much this has been costly for banks and citizens and government in Europe. So balance sheets of banks have been cleaned. And last but not least, I mean, you also mentioned the issue of sovereigns. And if you look at exposures of banks to sovereigns in Europe, has changed also vis-a-vis their respective sovereigns, so the sovereign bank nexus. So perhaps facts in Europe have shown that actually things here have worked in favor of independence. So I wanted to add this point of view. And last but not least, I kind of understood that what you claim could work better is a rule-based system where basically there's no discretion, but something which happens. And actually, it's intellectually interesting, but we have an example of that. Switzerland, it has been claimed before. We could have used the 81 story to have, or the old caucus as they were called, and they were not enacted. So actually, it didn't work. So yeah, we'll be curious to have a reaction on that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, I'm not going to try to respond to all those, but I do have responses to every one. By the way, I have a new paper with 2 Swiss colleagues talking about the failures of Swiss supervision and how markets give so much better information. But I don't want to get into that. I just want to correct a misimpression that I think I gave you, which is that markets always know best. I agree with you. Markets don't know better than we could possibly know, but they do know better than book values, okay? So what I was suggesting is we have enough information to hugely improve the system already, but to really make it all that it could be, we want to create, as part of the supervisory process, a new set of managerial accounts so that we actually measure using the inside information of the banks, that we actually measure the value and the risk in a way that takes full advantage of the private information from examination. And that would be better than just the market opinion. But currently, the market opinion is hugely better than the nonsense opinion.
So I have 2 questions, one coming from here. Should we not split the ECB in 2 parts? Well, this is what Germany always pleaded, and this is the reason why we did not have in the Maastricht Treaty the supervision, but this enabling article. There were only 3 central banks out of the whole European Union that had a separation. It's a principal discussion whether there are more synergies or more conflicts. The Germans with 2 others were on one side, the rest of the Union was on the other side. In the crisis, it was thought we need to bring it to the European level, supranational level. That article allowed it. No agency could have done it. So maybe it's not the best, cleanest solution, but this has served the purpose, and for more than 10 years now, it has worked. Why on earth would we want to separate them? I think it has shown that we can do it, and I can understand that there are still some people who think it would be more kosher to do that, but it is not the solution. The concrete solution was this one, and it has proven to work. The other point on the time inconsistency, why do we care? Well, I beg to disagree. It's even more. So the time inconsistency is still there. But because we have 21 states, we really have to preserve our independence from all these people who see it differently. Because I've been here very long, and I remember a time where the inflation in Ireland and in Germany was extremely different. There are times now in Estonia was incredibly high, and in some southern countries, or in Germany, was too low. Yeah, we have to set rates for the euro area. So you would be under an enormous pressure, even more than if you have only one government. So in fact, even more, you have to preserve this independence, apart from the time inconsistency, which I think still applies. Because the governments in Europe, yes, they don't get re-elected the same day, but there are years where there are 3 of them. Yeah? So there are some coincidence and convergence of interest. So I would really beg to say even more.
You did have no more questions?
No.
Oh.
No, I just wanted to say, I never meant to say that we cannot decide, supervisors cannot decide. I don't know why you understood this, but no, I was saying it is more complex because you have to consider so many aspects. That was all what I said.
Just to pick up this claim that civil servants would not be ready to take tough decisions. I mean, that's obviously not the case. And I think it shows that, well, for this accountability, which is so important for independent authorities, it's also important to have a discussion which is based on facts and evidence. And that's why I think it's so important that we show what we are doing, that we provide the transparency so that everyone can make up a view on that. But of course, we have a clear mandate, and that's I would say part of our personal also responsibility, that we live up to the mandate as a central bank does or any supervisory authority does. And it's also part of our mandate to keep up this independence in a personal matter, and also to keep the personal integrity that is part of this mandate.
Well, thank you very much. So I think we've already learned some things on why there is independence and why there could be independence and whether independence makes sense or not, and why some people are more skeptical than others, and why some interpret it this way or that way. I will pick up the similarities and differences point tomorrow, which I thought was very interesting, but I think we're all kind of nearing towards the end, and I thank you all a lot for raising your questions, and I thank all the great panelists, the three of you, and all the others that have contributed, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you back tomorrow.